Please make Sam feel welcome.
Thanks very much, Hiba. And I want to big shout out to the bravery of Fatima as well. True story, I first met Anthony Albanese when I was 16 years old and was attending my first Young Labor National Conference, and Albo was the Secretary of Young Labor. Another true story, my partner Janet, who you would have seen around the crowd, who is a founder of Jews for Palestine, her older sister used to take Albo, give him a lift home after their activist meetings at Sydney University. This is the same Albo in 2013 who was a member of Parliamentary Friends of Palestine, who now uses parliamentary privilege, the coward's castle, to call them, to call me, to call you, to call the Greens anti-Semitic. I mean, it makes me boil with anger, but we should draw strength from the fact that it is proof positive that they have run out of arguments. If they have to resort to that kind of thing, that is an admission that they are standing on nothing whatsoever. Now, the theme of this rally is Stop Arming Israel, and I want to address three ways that Australia effectively arms Israel. Now, first is the direct arms shipments. Australia gave 350 arms export licences to Israel since 2017. And that's why, and we're not going to cop, sorry to be frank about it, but there's bullshit from Labor MPs who say, oh, but Australia doesn't export arms. No, we export components. You know, sophisticated weapons are like cars. There's a massive production chain. The whole thing is, the whole thing isn't produced under the roof of in one factory. Australia is part of the production train. And in addition, there's the components for the F-35s that go to a parts store in the United States, and then they are then made available to Israel. That said, the total volume of Australian arms exports to Israel is still quite small. Australia's a big player. It's about $13 million, right? The big arms sellers to Israel are, of course, the United States and most recently Germany. In fact, Germany's arms exports have increased tenfold since October. And we could have a whole other discussion about how it is that the German political establishment thinks that the way it atones for the genocide it committed is to fund and resource another genocide. But there's the other way that Australia effectively arms Israel is through its other bilateral military ties. And one of those, of course, that you're familiar with is the deal with Elbit Systems. So a deal to purchase over $900 million worth of equipment from Elbit, an Israeli arms technology firm. So in the short term, that means, of course, Israel is actually arming Australia. But by pumping nearly $1 billion of our money, let's not forget, Australian taxpayers' money, into the Israeli industrially military complex, we are helping Israel arm. Make no mistake about it. And then the third one, which we don't often mention, which is perhaps most important, is that Australia arms Israel with intelligence. Intelligence feeds from Pine Gap. And now the new facility at Geraldton as well are feeding massive amounts of intelligence that are collected by satellites to the Israeli military, so they can spy on people and blackmail them, so that they can target their missiles. And we know they don't just target their missiles at military targets, but quite specifically to civilian targets. And in fact, Elbit Systems, they're providing technology in Australia for controlling weapons on armoured personnel carriers, but they also provide the avionics for weapons like drones of their very sort that we used to kill Zomi Frankham. So, and you think about that, in the days, literally days after the court decision to say that there is a plausible case of genocide, what does the Australian government do? Gives $917 million of our money to the Israeli industrial military complex. You could not give a bigger green light. Don't worry about the rhetoric and the hand-wringing about a ceasefire. All of us are judged by our actions, not by our words, and giving $917 million of our money to Elbit Systems was a green light to genocide. Okay, now, but this comes in the context of two things. It comes, one, in the context of what has been a bipartisan policy now for over a decade to try and really build up Australia as a leading arms exporter. And the bloody harvest of this process is already apparent, even before this latest cycle of violence in Gaza, with Australia exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, whose involvement in the war in Yemen led to the death of 200,000 people. And yet Australian government ministers say, oh, those arms exports to Saudi Arabia complied with our policy. I mean, if you've got an arms export policy where the absolutely horrendous, violent, feudal gangster regime like Saudi Arabia ticks the boxes, or Israel for that matter, your policy is clearly worthless. But it comes in the context where, you know, the world today now spends over $2 trillion a year on arms. There is an arms race going on. Australia is part of it. Australia is pushing it. And of course, in the context of the Western arms industry, Israel is totally integrated. Is an integrated part of the train. And of course, in decades past, Israel used to do the dirty work of the West, of the United States in particular, by funneling weapons to the apartheid regime, because the United States didn't want to be seen to do it itself, and also to some pretty bloodthirsty dictatorships in Central America. But nowadays, Israel also does the dirty work of the West by testing those weapons on the Palestinians. And so we have a situation where just the increase in spending on arms across the world last year, just the increase alone, is bigger than the commitments that were made at COP to tackle climate change. You know, it falls in this context. It also falls in the context, of course, of AUKUS, where Australia, you know, AUKUS isn't just about the submarines, it's coupled with the Forced Posture Agreement, which means American B-52s with nuclear weapons based at Darwin, more US access to our bases, and then coupled again with this ring of bases and missile systems that the United States is developing to point at China. And so Australia is being dragged along with a US project for confrontation with China. And we're being told not just to prepare for the possibility of war with China, but to make it happen, essentially. And although Australian politicians say, oh no, the nuclear submarines will be, Australia has sovereign control, the truth was let out by US Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, who made it very clear that the United States would not be supplying those nuclear submarines to Australia if it didn't expect them to be used in a war with China, if that's what the United States tries to do. Now, step back and think about it. If Australia is prepared to effectively give away its sovereignty and be committed to a war with China on terms defined by the United States, then it is in no position and will not call into question the US special relationship with Israel. And as you know, senior US officials themselves describe Israel as, quote, our unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. So until, you know, it bears out this fact that we need an independent foreign policy that breaks from following the United States on AUKUS and on Israel. And it's why, in July, Stop AUKUS WA and Friends of Palestine will be calling on you to join us for a whole range of protest activities at the Indian Ocean Defence and Security Conference that's going to be happening in July. This is going to be the biggest so-called defence and security, let's say, that they're really offence and warmongering conferences that's ever happened in Perth, probably the biggest one that's ever happened in Australia, and we cannot normalise this sort of stuff. We've got to be, and then, of course, as I mentioned before, because Israel is integrated into this whole Western military production process, there are going to be Israeli so-called defence people there as well. And we cannot normalise this happening in Perth. There's going to be a whole range of activities and you're going to find out about them. I just want to finish up on this point. I think Kiba was right to say that at the outset that this struggle for a just peace for the Palestinians isn't just about the Palestinians. It is actually about the future of humanity. The path to human liberation and justice in 2024 is going to lead through justice for Palestine. Because you ask yourself these questions. Do you want to live in a world where international law actually applies to everybody? Do you want to live in a world where people of the global south are allowed to develop and industrialise, but without following the environmentally destructive path that the West took to get there? Do you want to live in a world where we normalise the idea of states where all people have equal rights regardless of race, religion, ethnicity or language, you know? Do you want to live in a world where we harness the material and human resources that we're going to need to confront the existential challenge of climate change instead of confronting it by the path of a war for resources, repression and fascism? Because that is the path that we're being led down right at the moment. And It's very obvious. If we fail to defend the people of Palestine on this issue, then it makes all those jobs so much harder. And Fatima said, you know, we're on the right side of history. Well, we are on the right side of history, but that's not enough. We've actually got to make history. And sometimes you think, well, can we? Can we? There's no guarantees. But we should draw strength from the fact that opinion polls, and this was before the murder of Zombie Frankham and those other aid workers, opinion polls showed that 81% of Australians support a ceasefire and 54% thought the Australian government should do more to achieve a ceasefire. So I'm sure those numbers have gone up. But that means what our job is, when we finish this rally, is to go to the passive supporters, the people who think what's going on is terrible but aren't convinced they can do anything about it. They can do something about it. You can make history, but you have to do it.